I stopped being his wife the same week I realized I'd become his employee. It was a Thursday in October when I opened the shared calendar to add his dentist appointment. The same calendar I'd been updating for a decade. The one that held our entire life in color-coded blocks. Blue for work, green for personal, red for family, purple for us. I knew which recurring meetings mattered and which he'd skip. I knew he preferred morning calls, that he blocked Fridays after 3, that he never scheduled anything during his daughter's soccer games. I knew the architecture of his time better than I knew the shape of my own days. The appointment synced. I scrolled down to confirm it had placed correctly, past the usual entries, past the standing Monday reviews and Wednesday check-ins. And there, beginning in late July and continuing forward into infinity, were meetings I had never created. Every Tuesday and Thursday evening, 7 o'clock, 90 minutes each. No location listed, just 2 letters in the subject line. KM, this isn't fiction. This is how love disappears, one small truth at a time. Before that Thursday, our life looked like competence. We had systems. I managed his schedule because he asked me to, years ago, when his practice expanded and mine contracted. It made sense then. I was working from home, consulting part-time, flexible in ways he couldn't be. He was a surgeon. His time belonged to other people's emergencies, their tumors, their fear, so I became the one who remembered. Parent-teacher conferences, oil changes, anniversary dinners, his mother's birthday. The calendar was my domain, and I was good at it. Our house smelled like coffee in the mornings and rosemary in the evenings. I cooked meals he ate standing up between patient calls. We had a blue ceramic bowl by the front door where he dropped his keys every night. Always the same sound, metal against pottery, a small bell marking his return. He'd find me in the kitchen or the study, kiss the top of my head without stopping his conversation, disappear into his office for an hour. Later, we'd sit together on the couch, his hand on my knee, half watching television we'd forget by morning. We didn't fight much. We didn't talk much either. But I mistook efficiency for intimacy. I thought managing his life meant being inside it. I remember the exact moment I became his assistant instead of his partner, though I didn't recognize it then. It was 3 years into our marriage. We were getting ready for a dinner party. His colleagues, their spouses, the kind of evening that required performance. He was running late from the hospital, texting me updates every 15 minutes. I'd already set the table, prepared the appetizers, chilled the wine. When he finally arrived, 20 minutes before guests, he kissed me quickly and said, "Thank God you're so organized. I don't know what I'd do without you." I'd glowed at the compliment. I'd thought it meant I was valuable. I didn't understand that I was being assigned a role I'd spend the next 11 years perfecting, until the role became my entire identity, and I forgot there had ever been anything else. There were details I noticed without naming. How he started closing his office door more often, how his phone, once left casually on the counter, now lived in his pocket, how he began running in the evenings, something he'd never done, not in 15 years of marriage. He said it helped him think. I said it was good for his heart. We were both performing belief. I didn't know then that I was already mourning. The first time I saw KM on the calendar, I assumed it was a patient consult. But surgeons don't block 90-minute evening appointments, and they don't repeat them twice a week for 3 months without variation. I sat at the kitchen table with my laptop open, staring at those 2 initials. My coffee had gone cold. Outside, a neighbor's dog barked in short, rhythmic bursts. The refrigerator hummed its constant low note. I could hear the clock in the hallway ticking, the one we'd bought at an antique store in Vermont, the one that had always run 3 minutes fast. Everything sounded suddenly louder, as if the world had been turned up while I wasn't paying attention. I scrolled backward through the calendar, looking for the patterns beginning. July 23rd, the first Tuesday after we returned from his mother's house in Maine. I remembered that trip. He'd been distracted, checking his phone by the lake, saying work was unusually demanding. His mother had asked if everything was all right between us. I'd laughed and said we were fine. We were always fine. She'd looked at me with something like pity, but I'd dismissed it as her tendency toward drama. I didn't confront him that night. I told myself I needed to be sure. But certainty is a lie we tell ourselves when we already know the truth and can't yet bear to speak it. Instead, I started looking. The search wasn't dramatic. There was no ransacking of drawers, no midnight rifling through coat pockets. I simply began to see. Details I'd been stepping over for months suddenly stood upright and demanded attention. The receipts in his car's cup holder, coffee from a place we'd never been, 20 minutes in the wrong direction from the hospital, charged at 6:47 p.m. on a Tuesday, and another Thursday, and 3 more Tuesdays after that. I held one of the receipts up to the light as if it might reveal something more than the obvious, as if the paper itself might confess. The way he'd started saying my name differently, Sarah instead of Sar, as if adding the extra syllable created distance, formality, the space you'd give a colleague. I tested it one evening, listening to how the sound fell between us. Sarah, have you seen my phone? Not, Sarah, where'd I put my keys? The intimacy we'd built through abbreviation had evaporated, and I'd been too busy updating his calendar to notice when. The evening runs that lasted exactly 90 minutes. He'd return flushed, apologetic, smelling like hotel soap. The gym has better showers, he'd said once. We didn't have a gym membership. I'd nodded anyway, added it to the list of things I knew, and pretended not to. His laptop history, which I checked one afternoon with shaking hands and immediate regret. Searches for restaurants I'd never heard of, a jewelry store in the city, and, buried in his bookmarks, an apartment listing website. 1-bedroom units downtown, saved and resaved, prices compared across neighborhoods I knew he had no reason to visit. Each discovery was a small stone added to a pile. Individually, they meant nothing. Together, they built a cairn. I became archaeological in my observations. The house we'd lived in for 8 years transformed into an excavation site. I found a matchbook from a hotel bar in his jacket pocket, the black wool one he wore to conferences. I found a charge on our credit card statement for flowers I'd never received. I found one morning while he was in the shower a text notification on his phone, face down on the nightstand. Last night was perfect. I didn't open the phone. I didn't need to. The notification told me everything. I became someone I didn't recognize. I checked the calendar compulsively, watching for changes, additions, deletions. I memorized the pattern of KM's appearances, waiting to see if they'd multiply or vanish. They did neither. They simply persisted, reliable as a heartbeat. I stopped sleeping well. At 2 a.m., I'd lie beside him, listening to his breathing, wondering if he dreamed of her, if her name sounded different in his mouth than mine did, if she knew about me, or if I'd been edited out of his story entirely, reduced to my wife in passing, a logistical complication rather than a person. Some nights I'd get up and stand in the bathroom with the door closed, staring at my reflection in the mirror. I looked the same, 41 years old, brown hair starting to show gray at the temples, the faint lines around my eyes that he used to trace with his finger. But I felt like a stranger, like someone playing the role of Sarah, reading lines from a script I'd never agreed to memorize. During the day, I moved through our home like a stranger cataloging evidence. The house we'd repainted together, chosen furniture for, filled with 14 years of accumulated life. Now every room felt like a museum of my own ignorance. The framed photos on the mantel, us at 30, grinning on a beach in Croatia, seemed like artifacts from someone else's marriage. I kept cooking dinner, kept updating his calendar, kept pretending I didn't notice when he showered before coming to bed instead of after waking, kept pretending that pretending was sustainable. I became a detective of my own life. I started documenting things in a notebook I kept hidden in my desk drawer. Dates, times, inconsistencies. Tuesday, September 12th. Said he was at the hospital until 9 km. Meeting on calendar ended at 8:30. Arrived home at 9:47. Thursday, September 21st. Came home with new cologne. When I asked about it, said a patient's family gave it to him as a thank you gift. The bottle was opened, half empty. Some nights I'd open my mouth to ask him directly. The words would rise up my throat and stop there, too frightened to become sound. Because asking meant knowing, and knowing meant choosing. And I wasn't ready to choose anything except continuation. I told myself I was waiting for the right moment. But there is no right moment to watch your life collapse. There's only the moment when you can no longer hold up the ceiling. By the time the leaves changed, I knew her name, Caitlin Morris. I found it in his email, not hidden, just unopened by me until the night I finally looked. She was a surgical resident at the hospital, 29 years old. I found her staff photo on the hospital website. Dark hair pulled back, serious expression. The kind of intelligence that translates immediately through a photograph. She looked nothing like me. Or maybe she looked exactly like a younger version of me, the one who still believed efficiency was the same as love. Her messages to him were professional at first, then familiar, then something else entirely. I read through months of careful escalation, April emails about surgical techniques and case studies, May emails that included questions about his weekend plans, June emails where she thanked him for dinner, for his mentorship, for his time, July emails where the word mentorship disappeared entirely, replaced by I miss you already and counting the hours until Tuesday. I sat in his office reading months of careful dishonesty. Not lies, exactly. Nothing he wrote was false. But every word was a brick in a wall that kept me outside. They discussed cases, conferences, a research project they were collaborating on, and woven through the medicine were moments of tenderness that belonged to me. Inside jokes about surgical residents' coffee habits, song lyrics from bands I'd introduced him to in our 20s. Once a photo of sunrise from what I recognized, sickeningly, as the window of a downtown hotel we'd stayed in for our 10th anniversary. He'd taken her to our hotel. I didn't cry. I closed the laptop and walked to the bathroom and vomited, quietly so I wouldn't wake him. Then I brushed my teeth and returned to bed and lay there until morning, listening to the casual rhythm of his sleep. In the morning, he woke and stretched and smiled at me the way he always did. "Sleep okay?" he asked. "Fine," I said, and we went on pretending. The pretending took on its own architecture. We had separate performances we'd each perfected. He pretended he was working late, stressed but devoted, too busy to notice my increasing silence. I pretended I believed him, that I didn't see the way his face changed when his phone buzzed, that I didn't notice how he angled the screen away from me even when showing me something innocuous. We had entire conversations that meant nothing. He'd tell me about a surgery, I'd tell him about a client call. We'd discuss groceries, bills, his mother's upcoming visit. We were fluent in logistics. We'd lost the language for everything else. I started declining social invitations. The performance was exhausting enough at home. I couldn't sustain it in public. Friends asked if I was okay. I gave them variations of the same answer. Just busy. Work's demanding. They accepted this. People always accept the explanations you give them if those explanations are easier than the truth. My sister called one evening in October. "You sound strange," she said. "I'm fine." "Sarah, you're not." I sat on the back porch with the phone pressed to my ear, watching the sun set over our neighbor's fence. "I think David's having an affair," I said. The words felt both impossible and obvious. The silence on the other end of the line stretched so long I thought the call had dropped. Then, "Are you sure?" "Yes." "No, I don't know. I haven't asked him." "Why not?" "Because then it becomes real." My sister, who'd been divorced twice, who understood the mathematics of betrayal, said quietly, "Sarah, it's already real. Not asking doesn't protect you. It just keeps you trapped in not knowing." We talked for another hour. She told me I deserved better. I told her I'd built my entire life around being the person who made his life work. "Who am I if I'm not that?" I asked. "I don't know," she said. "But maybe that's what you get to find out." The confrontation happened on a Sunday afternoon in November in our kitchen, surrounded by the ordinary debris of weekend life. I'd spent the morning rehearsing sentences that evaporated the moment he walked into the room. He was making tea. The kettle screamed and he lifted it, poured water into his blue mug, the one I'd bought him on our 5th anniversary, the one that said, "Best doctor, best husband," in white letters that had started to fade. I watched him add honey, exactly 1 spoonful, the way he always did. The domesticity of it made everything worse. "Who is KM?" I asked. My voice came out smaller than I'd intended, almost apologetic, as if I were the one intruding on his privacy by asking about my own marriage. He stopped stirring. The spoon hung suspended in the mug. For 3 seconds, maybe 4, he was perfectly still. I watched his shoulders rise and fall with a single deep breath. Then he set the spoon down carefully on the counter and turned to face me. "Sarah." Just my name. Not a denial, not a question. An acknowledgement that we had finally arrived at a conversation he'd been both dreading and expecting. "I need you to tell me the truth," I said. "Not a version of it. The truth." He pulled out a chair and sat down heavily, elbows on the table, hands covering his face. When he looked up, he seemed older than he had that morning, tired in a way that had nothing to do with sleep. "Her name is Caitlin," he said. "She's a resident. He paused, searching for language that wouldn't detonate. We've been seeing each other since July. Since July. Since the Tuesday after Maine. Since before I'd noticed. Since a moment I couldn't name or reclaim or undo. The kitchen clock ticked. The refrigerator hummed. Outside, someone was mowing their lawn. The world continued its ordinary operations while mine stopped. Are you in love with her? It was the question I most needed answered and most feared asking. He looked at me for a long time before responding, and in that silence I understood that some questions are cruelest when answered honestly. I don't know, he said finally. I don't know what I feel, except that I've been unhappy for a long time, and with her, I'm not. The simplicity of it was obscene. I'd organized his life, anticipated his needs, built my days around his schedule, and what I'd mistaken for partnership had been administration. He hadn't needed a wife. He'd needed an assistant. And when he'd wanted something else, connection, desire, the possibility of feeling new, he'd found someone whose job wasn't managing him. How long have you been unhappy? I asked. Years, Sarah, years, years. I thought of all the dinners I'd cooked, the appointments I'd remembered, the careful maintenance of our shared life. I thought of how I'd translated his silence as contentment, how I'd stopped asking if he was happy because I'd been afraid of the answer, how I'd pruned myself down to fit the space he'd left available, never wondering if that space was shrinking. Did you ever think about telling me? My voice cracked. Before you found someone else? I thought about it constantly, he said. But we were so efficient together. Everything worked, and I kept thinking if I just waited, if I focused on work, the feeling would pass. And then it didn't. And then there was Caitlin, and she made me remember what it felt like to be chosen instead of scheduled. Chosen instead of scheduled. The phrase lodged itself in my chest like a stone. I chose you, I said. Every day for 14 years I chose you. You chose to manage me, he said, not unkindly. There's a difference. I wanted to argue, but sitting there in our kitchen, with his tea cooling between us and November light slanting through the window, I couldn't. Because he was right. Somewhere along the way, I'd stopped being his partner and become his administrator. I'd stopped asking what he wanted and started anticipating what he needed. I'd confused utility with intimacy. I'd believed that making his life easier was the same as making him happy. What do you want? I asked finally. He looked at his hands. I don't know. I don't want to hurt you more than I already have. That's not the same as wanting to stay. No, he said quietly. It's not. We sat there for a long time, not speaking. The silence was uncomfortable, but it was honest. Maybe the first honest thing we'd shared in years. Finally, I stood up. My legs felt unsteady, as if I'd forgotten how to hold my own weight. I need you to leave, I said. Not forever, just tonight. I need to be alone. He nodded. I'll go to my brother's. Take the blue bowl, I said. For your keys. You'll need it. He looked at me strangely. Sarah, just take it. He did. He moved out 3 weeks later, the week before Thanksgiving. We told people it was temporary, that we needed space to work on things. But we both knew temporary was a kindness we were performing for his mother, for our friends, for the neighbors who'd ask questions. He took his clothes, his books, his degree from the wall of the study. He left the furniture, the kitchen utensils, the framed photos. He left me the house we'd chosen together and the calendar I'd spent 10 years filling with his life. The morning he finished packing, we stood in the driveway while he loaded boxes into his car. It was cold. Our breath made small clouds between us. I'd worn his old sweatshirt without thinking, and when I realized, I almost went inside to change. But there seemed no point in pretending I wasn't still tethered to him, even as he was leaving. I'm sorry, he said. For all of it, for the lying, for the cowardice, for waiting until it was too late to fix anything. I wanted to tell him I forgave him. I wanted to scream. I wanted to ask if Caitlin would be better at loving him than I had been. Instead, I said, I hope you find whatever it is you're looking for. He hugged me then, and I let him, even though it felt like being hollowed out. When he pulled away, his eyes were wet. You deserved better than this, he said. Yes, I agreed. I did. He got in his car. I watched him back down the driveway, watched him pause at the stop sign, watched him turn left toward whatever life he was building without me. Then I walked back inside and closed the door and stood in the entryway, surrounded by the accumulated evidence of our marriage, and felt the house exhale. The months that followed were unremarkable in their devastation. I learned to cook for one. I stopped updating the shared calendar, stopped opening it entirely, and created a new one that held only my own time. I discovered that my days, without his appointments anchoring them, had no clear structure. I'd been so busy managing his life that I'd forgotten how to build my own. Friends called. I told them I was fine. They didn't believe me, but they pretended to, which was its own kindness. His mother called once, crying, asking what had happened. I told her to ask her son. She never called again. 6 months later, I heard through mutual friends that she died of a heart attack. David didn't tell me himself. I found out from the obituary. I sent flowers to the funeral home and a card that said simply, "I'm sorry for your loss." I didn't go to the service. There are some performances grief doesn't allow. I started therapy. My therapist was a woman in her 60s with gray hair and the kind eyes of someone who'd seen every variation of human suffering and still believed in repair. She asked me what I'd lost. I told her my marriage. She asked what else. I couldn't answer. It took weeks before I could name it. I'd lost the story I'd been telling myself about who I was. The capable one, the organized one, the wife who made everything work. Without that story, I didn't know who I was supposed to be. "Maybe that's the point," my therapist said. "Maybe you get to decide now." I started filling my calendar with things that had nothing to do with David. Yoga classes I'd always wanted to try, book clubs, long walks in the park where we used to run together, reclaiming the geography of my own city. I took a pottery class and was terrible at it, but I went back every Wednesday anyway. I learned that being bad at something was its own kind of freedom. Winter came, then spring, then the kind of summer that felt both endless and immediate. I moved through the seasons mechanically, tending to the house, returning to work full-time, rebuilding routines that belonged only to me. Occasionally, I'd see updates about him on social media, photos from conferences, a research award, evidence of a life continuing without pause. I never saw her in his photos, but I knew she was there, living in the negative space of everything he chose to share publicly. My sister visited in April. We sat on my back porch drinking wine and watching the sunset. "You seem different," she said. "Different how?" "Quieter, but also louder, if that makes sense. Like you're taking up more space than you used to." I thought about that, about how I'd spent 14 years making myself smaller so David's life could expand, about how I'd believed that was what love required. "I'm learning," I said. "Learning what?" "How to be a person instead of a function." She raised her glass. "To that." We drank and I felt something like peace. In July, exactly 1 year after KM first appeared on the calendar, the divorce papers arrived. I signed them at my kitchen table with a pen that had been a gift from him years ago, back when we'd still been tender with each other. The irony wasn't lost on me. We divided our assets with the same efficiency we'd once brought to our marriage. Everything was fair, equitable, bloodless. We met once, briefly, in a lawyer's office to finalize details. He looked good, rested, happy in a way I'd never managed to make him. I was glad for him and furious at him and mostly just tired of carrying both feelings simultaneously. "How are you?" he asked in the parking lot afterward. "I'm learning," I said. He nodded, as if he understood. Maybe he did. Maybe that's what we'd both been doing all along, learning how to leave each other, one small failure at a time. Now, more than 2 years after that Thursday in October, I live alone in a smaller house across town. I kept almost nothing from our marriage except books, some photographs I can't quite discard, and a blue ceramic bowl I found in a thrift store 3 months after David moved out. It's not the same one. I'd told him to take that. But it's similar enough. I use it for my own keys now. I still think about him. Not every day, but often enough. I think about the version of him I'd loved, or the version I'd believed existed. I think about how we'd both been complicit in our failure, how I'd chosen management over vulnerability, how he'd chosen silence over honesty, how we'd built a marriage that looked functional from the outside and was hollow at its center. I think about KM so too, Caitlin. I've never met her, but I know she's still with him. They got engaged last fall. I heard through mutual friends who didn't know whether to tell me and decided transparency was kinder than protection. The wedding is scheduled for October, a fall wedding like ours was. I hope she makes him happy. I hope he's learned to speak his unhappiness before it becomes betrayal. I hope they're better together than we were. I hope she never has to discover herself replaced in a calendar she spent years maintaining. Mostly, though, I think about the calendar, that shared document we'd both contributed to, that map of our intertwined lives. I think about how I'd believed that managing his time meant mattering to him, how I'd confused utility with intimacy, how I'd spent 10 years being indispensable and never thought to ask if I was also loved. I deleted that calendar eventually. It felt necessary, like removing a splinter that had been embedded too long. But sometimes I still catch myself thinking in color-coded blocks. Blue for work, green for personal, red for obligations. Old habits wear grooves too deep to fill completely. I've started dating, cautiously, men who ask questions, men who don't need managing, men who understand that love requires more than logistical coordination. It's strange, learning to be wanted rather than useful. Strange to realize those shouldn't be the same thing. Last month, I went on a third date with someone named Michael, an architect, divorced, father of 2. We went to dinner and talked for 3 hours. Afterward, walking me to my car, he said, "I'd like to see you again. What does your schedule look like next week?" I pulled out my phone to check my calendar, the new one, the one that holds only my own time, and I realized I had no idea what next week looked like. I'd stopped planning everything in advance. I'd stopped living 2 weeks ahead, anticipating and accommodating and organizing. I was finally, after 2 years of practice, living in present tense. "I don't know," I told him. "Let me get back to you," he smiled. "That's perfect." And it was. Last week, I was entering an appointment into my phone, just mine, just a dentist visit, nothing shared. And I thought about that Thursday 2 years ago, how one small discovery had unraveled everything I'd believed was secure. How the calendar I'd tended so carefully had contained the evidence of my own erasure, and I'd been too busy updating it to notice. I thought about how we leave traces of ourselves in the things we build together. Calendars, homes, routines, the small ceremonies of shared life. And how sometimes those traces are all that's left when the people who made them are gone. I thought about forgiveness too, whether I'd forgiven him, whether he'd forgiven me, whether forgiveness was even the right question. Because here's what I've learned. Some betrayals aren't single acts but accumulations. A marriage doesn't end the night someone admits to an affair. It ends slowly, across hundreds of small moments when honesty would have hurt less than silence. It ends when 2 people stop seeing each other and begin only seeing the roles they've assigned. The manager, the managed, the one who stays, the one who leaves. He didn't destroy our marriage by loving someone else. We'd been dismantling it for years. One unspoken resentment at a time, one unasked question at a time, one moment of choosing efficiency over truth. I'd been so busy being useful that I'd forgotten to be present. And he'd been so busy being grateful for my usefulness that he'd forgotten to wonder if I was happy. We'd both failed. Not dramatically, not intentionally, just consistently, in small ways, until the small ways added up to something irreparable. And maybe that's the thing nobody tells you about betrayal. Sometimes the person you're angriest at is yourself, for not noticing sooner, for mistaking function for feeling, for spending years building a life you thought was shared, only to discover you'd been building it alone. I'm learning to live in my own time now. Not his, not ours, mine. Some days that feels like freedom. Some days it feels like exile. Most days it's both. I have a new calendar now, smaller, simpler, containing only appointments I choose for myself. It's mostly empty still, but I'm filling it slowly. Coffee with friends, yoga classes, a pottery workshop I'd always wanted to try, lunch with my sister, dates with Michael, who still doesn't know about the calendar, about KM, about the way I discovered that my life had been quietly replaced while I was too busy managing it to notice. Maybe I'll tell him eventually, or maybe some stories are meant to stay private, carried forward as lessons rather than confessions. Small markers of a life I'm constructing from scratch, one commitment at a time. And some evenings, when the house is quiet and I'm making dinner just for myself, I'll pause at the counter and remember how it felt to believe I was essential to someone. How I'd organized his days as if they were my own. How I'd mistaken proximity for partnership. I don't miss him exactly. I miss who we were before we became who we weren't. I miss the version of us that existed before routine calcified into obligation. I miss believing that love was something you could maintain through careful attention, like a garden, like a calendar, like any other thing you tend. But you can't schedule intimacy. You can't color code devotion. You can't organize your way into being chosen. I know that now. And maybe that's the gift hidden inside the betrayal, the terrible, necessary understanding that I'd spent 10 years perfecting a role I was never supposed to play. That being needed isn't the same as being loved, that I'd built my entire identity around making his life easier, and in doing so, I'd made myself disappear. The calendar taught me that. Those two initials, KM, appearing twice a week in the life I thought I was managing. Proof that while I'd been scheduling his dentist appointments and color-coding his commitments, he'd been building a separate existence I was never meant to see. I'm grateful for that Thursday in October now, even though it broke me, because it also freed me. It forced me to stop managing and start living. It taught me that some knowledge, however painful, is better than willful blindness. It showed me that I'd been so busy being competent that I'd forgotten to be alive. Tonight, I'll make dinner and eat it slowly, without rushing to update anyone's calendar or accommodate anyone's schedule. I'll sit in my quiet house and feel the particular peace that comes from occupying your own time completely. And when I open my calendar tomorrow to plan the week ahead, I'll see only my own appointments, my own choices, my own life, unshared and mine. There's a strange comfort in that, not happiness, not yet, but something close to it, something that feels like the beginning of understanding. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I'd never looked at the calendar that Thursday. If I'd just kept updating it, kept managing his life, kept pretending that utility was the same as love. How much longer would I have continued? How many more years would I have given to the performance? I'll never know. And I'm glad I don't. Because here's the truth I've carried forward from that November kitchen, from those divorce papers signed in July, from every quiet evening since when I've sat alone and felt both lonely and whole. I never stopped loving him. I just stopped waiting for him to see me. And that, learning to see myself, to value myself, to choose myself, that was the only calendar entry that ever really mattered.